Hello and welcome to another episode of the Revisited series. In this episode, we'll talk about Clover again. Clover was mentioned as part of the episode on animals and forages in terms of their domestication and history. I missed a bit of information, so here's me mopping it up. We'll start off with a paper by Dr. Torkit Kierkegaard, talking about the rise and fall of clover. During the era of human farming, one of the perennial problems was nutrient supply, specifically nitrogen, which was always a limiting factor in any farming system. In times gone by, when cities became a thing, most of the nutrients were extracted as seeds and shipped off to cities, preventing any returning nutrients to the soil. Up to and including 700 BC, and possibly longer, most of the feces produced by the cities was recollected and sent back to the farms to be used as fertilizers. Another remedy used to deal with nitrogen deficits was already known in ancient times, and was recommended by various classical agricultural authorities such as Theophrastus, Varro, Cato, Columella, Palladius, and Virgil. This was the production of pea family members, such as legumes, especially vetch, lupins, broad beans, peas, and lentils. Though they did not know it at the time, or anything about the nature of the nutrients involved in terms of chemistry, they did know that these crops improve the soil. This is because pea family members have a symbiotic relationship with a bacteria called rhizobium. This bacteria fixes nitrogen in the air into a more consumable form when they reside within the roots themselves in special tumor-like structures called nodules. However, as time went on, cities grew more populous and even larger, and the nitrogen supplements from peas would not cut it as a source of nutrients anymore. During the 14th and 13th centuries in medieval Europe, the degradation of the land was on the rise, and the amount of crops being produced had diminishing returns. This was stalled, however, by the appearance of the Black Death, which halved the population of Europe. The malnutrition during that time period may have also contributed to the success of this plague in killing so many people. In the 16th century, European populations were recovering, and by the 1700s, free European cities had more than 500,000 inhabitants. As a result, the derogation of the land problem became a problem of major concern. The 17th century was essentially a nitrogen revolution among many European countries, due to them experiencing identical problems in terms of nutrient diminishment. During that era, the annual nutrient supplement of nitrogen received by the plowed land was only a measly 30 kilograms per hectare. This is about 10 to 15% of the average nitrogen application done in arable land today. The increasing high standards of living could not be kept up with due to the diminishing level of food that could be derived from the diminishing nutrients in the land itself. To that end, forests were cut down to plant more fields, even though these soils were ill-suited for the use of crop production. But then it was discovered that domesticated clover could do the trick in fixing all the agricultural problems of that era. Now, how did this happen? Well, thanks to the advent of modern science, in 1975, an experiment was done to showcase how much nitrogen was fixed into the soil. On average, peas and lupins fix about 63 to 70 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. Red clover, on the other hand, could fix 215 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. During the second millennium, clover was a new crop. Barley, wheat, oats, and rye, in concert with other common legume crops, had been cultivated for thousands of years, since the beginning of agriculture. Clover, which was found everywhere in Europe and in the Middle East, became a wild plant, and was not domesticated until much later. In the region of Andalusia, run by the Moors at that time period, various philosophers of agriculture were working diligently in trying to domesticate clover, and by the time 1270 AD became a thing, clover was domesticated. During that time period, the Moors had introduced clover to Spain in the Middle Ages. After the Moors were repelled, clover remained and was utilized in agriculture. Afterwards, through conquest, the Spaniards introduced clover across Europe, specifically to the Netherlands, and from there reached France, where it was then disseminated all across Europe. This plant was well loved by agronomists due to its ability to fertilize the soil quite nicely. An agronomist from Britain called Sir Richard Weston likewise found the Flemish clover farming system in a region called Ghent during the 17th century, specifically 1644. And through its influence, domesticated clover has spread all across England as a means of improving the agricultural lands of Britain. 1 year after clover was introduced to Britain, it became introduced to Germany, and from there went to all German-speaking countries. From there it reached all the island nations of Europe, starting in 1710 in the Danish island of Fenmarm, and finally reached Denmark in 1730. And so every country within Europe. This attempt in 1730 failed, however. A second attempt happened in 1732, however, and by the end of the 1740s, Denmark had the ability to grow clover like everybody else, and from there it spread to Sweden and Finland. Although skepticism about the properties of clover remained a thing within the Nordic countries from 1779 until 1794. And it worked. And it gradually expanded until all parts of the Nordic countries had found a way to grow clover within this region. The use of clover in fertilizing the field became the norm by the time the 19th century appeared. And you can see why grain production in Denmark and many other parts of the world had doubled within the last decades of the 18th century. It was also used extensively as fodder for cattle. There was a reduction in grazing land because it was easier to feed cattle and sheep on a smaller amount of land using grass and clover than it was using large fields of grass. This allowed for the forest to gradually regrow. During this time, the cattle population of the Danish people increased from 450,000 to 600,000. From 1800 to 1900, this was the era of clover. Coal was being used extensively during this time period, but so was nitrogen-fixing crops. Various clover species were being heavily utilized to provide food for cattle and nitrogen for plants, not just cereals but also for more demanding crops such as potatoes and beets. Indeed, during this era, potatoes were totally dependent on clover for nitrogen sources. Indeed, the era of the potato was thanks to the era of the clover, as all the nitrogen used to grow the large tuber of a potato came directly from the clover itself. Indeed, it's speculated that the clover had a greater influence on European civilization than the potato did. One of the Duchesses of Schleswig in Denmark in 1761 said, "Clover would transform our barren northern country into a new Canaan flowing with milk and honey." This is technically true since clover allowed for an increase in the number of cattle, increasing milk production, and honeybees really like clover, so more honey. Much of the landscape has also been changed in Denmark thanks to the introduction of clover, as the flowers changed the vista of that region by a considerable margin due to the unique red and white flowers of that era. This became adopted by writers and painters. Another indirect effect was a reduction in malaria, since the malaria-spreading mosquitoes prefer cattle over humans. And with the life cycle severed, malaria was on the decline, except in southern Europe, where specific mosquitoes that had a preference for human blood were still functioning, and it was through this species that malaria was able to survive into the 20th century. Unfortunately for clover, all things have to come to an end. In the 1930s, during the last days of clover, Denmark declared the red clover to be a national plant. But the days of clover were numbered thanks to the German chemist Fritz Haber, who developed the Haber-Bosch process, which allowed for the mass production of nitrogen without the need of plants. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Haber-Bosch method was only used on a limited scale. But after the Second World War ended, industrial production of nitrogen expanded. creating a worldwide production of 4 million tons of artificial fertilizers, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium put together, per year in 1940. It increased to 40 million tons in 1965, and by 1990, 150 million tons of fertilizer was manufactured per year. And so ended the era of clover. But there are still more stories to tell. Let's talk about the domestication of the Kura clover. One of the many species of clover that were domesticated was Kura clover. All true clovers are part of the Trifolium genus, which include 250 species. 10 species in total were domesticated. 5 include the annual species Persian clover, crimson clover, Egyptian clover, Subterranean clover, and yellow suckling clover. The 5 perennial clovers were white clover, red clover, outside clover, and strawberry clover, as well as Kura clover. Kura clover is a long day plant, meaning that it flowers after the appearance of lengthening days and shortening nights during spring. Indeed, in Connecticut, flowering begins in mid-May and continues through June. Kura clover cannot crossbreed with itself and must be pollinated by another Kura clover in order to produce seeds. There have been attempts to hybridize Kura clover with white clover and outside clover. Most of the seeds of these hybrids die, unfortunately, so this plant failed. Eventually, a stable hybrid created through embryo rescue, where the embryo gets tissue cultured, with only a few of the tissue culture samples surviving long enough to be used to make new plants, and even fewer being able to be pollinated. One such hybrid was then crossed back into a white clover to create a stable hybrid. Kura clover is indigenous to Russia, as well as Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Crimea, the Black Sea coast of the Ukraine, eastern Turkey, and northern Iran. It was first attempted to be domesticated by the USSR, but the ones who successfully domesticated it was the people of New Zealand. It was found that the ability of Kura clover to grow in poorly drained soils was the primary reason that people were looking into it as a means of replacing red clover or white clover in certain farming situations. Indeed, this crop is able to grow in freestanding water, and was even able to survive drought as well. The second attempt to domesticate it was in the United States. It was found to produce very limited amounts of roughage for cattle, but due to the high nectar production, it was used heavily in apiaries in the United States as a crop known as honey clover. It was flawed in many ways though. It established very slowly, but the flowers had a nice scent and high levels of nectar. The sugar content of the nectar ranged between 42 to 58%, but nonetheless, the interest in this crop diminished over time. The third attempt at domestication occurred in Australia using remnants of United States specimens. This resulted in the creation of new named cultivars by 1974. This was further refined through a joint project between New Zealand and Australia for soil conservation purposes. Further research from this project also found that the freeze-thaw action that usually lifts up alfalfa roots out of the ground, and the various viruses that are normally detrimental to other species of clover, are not as much of a problem for this species, and indeed all forms of livestock are able to eat it. The yields, however, remain low, but it's much more functional as a forage than most other legume crops available in both Australia and New Zealand. The yield was improved through discovery of a new strain of the rhizobium that they commonly bond with called Rhizobium trifoliae. This strain of Rhizobium trifoliae, CC231, obtained from eastern Turkey, functioned better than the wild strain of Rhizobium trifoliae that was already nascent within the common Kura clover. This one turned out to be a lot less efficient than the wild one, but a third attempt with CC283b was so highly effective that it increased the yield of this species by a considerable margin by improving nitrogen fixation. While this domesticated crop is still not yet completed, in terms of becoming fully domesticated, it is coming close to being domesticated. All that's left is to figure out how to improve establishment. And now we'll conclude with our final video on the origin, ancestry, and domestication of Egyptian clover. The last clover we'll cover is Egyptian clover, or berseem. This is the annual species Trifolium alexandrium. It is widely cultivated in Western Asia and Northern Africa. During the 20th century, the cultivation was extended into Central Asia, specifically Pakistan and India, and parts of the United States. There are two existing subspecies of berseem, the Alexandrium subspecies and the Serotoninum subspecies. The former only produces one crop of forage per cultivation. The latter can produce 4 to 6 harvests per cultivation. The former produces apical branching, producing only branches from the top growth, while the latter has side growth. A third variety that seems to be the combination of both has both basal and apical branching, and is able to produce 2 to 3 crops per cultivation. In Egypt, where crop rotation is necessary for agricultural practice, both groups are used and are planted in October and harvested in January and February to enrich the soil prior to cotton cultivation. Other varieties are cultivated from October to May. The origin of the species has been debated for quite some time, and there's been many speculations and writings about its origin. Dr. Hegi in 1923 had the hypothesis that the rulers of Egypt from the 12th to 15th century introduced a species of clover into Egypt from the Caucasus region, where it was then domesticated into its modern form. Dr. Becker-Dellingen, however, believed that it was introduced into Egypt in the 6th century. Dr. Podlaski came up with a hypothesis that it was actually domesticated very early on and was probably one of the first domesticated forages in Egypt. Dr. Day, in 1975, suggested that berseem was domesticated in the first Egyptian dynasty between 3500 BC and 3800 BC, and was likely native to the Nile Valley. Dr. Trabut put forward the idea that Trifolium berephium, which is native to the coastal plains of Lebanon, was a wild form of berseem. Dr. Eeg confirmed through an analysis that showcased that both species seem very similar. Another hypothesis was laid out by Dr. Aaron Son, however, who saw wild berseem in Palestine and claimed that the species Trifolium echatum was the wild ancestor. Dr. Bobrov, on the other hand, claimed that Trifolium apertum was the progenitor of berseem due to the morphological similarities between both species. Dr. Oppenheimer also accepted the view that berseem and Trifolium berephium were similar species, and the former was derived from the latter, and rejected the claims of the others who claimed that either Trifolium echatum or aparitum were likely ancestors. Later studies by Dr. Podlaski and Castleton were done on Trifolium alexandrium, or berseem, and its wild relatives to see which one developed to breed berseem. Different crossbreeding experiments were done to see which ones would crossbreed with each other. It was found that Trifolium berephium and Trifolium salomonum both produced successful hybrids with Trifolium alexandrium. From this, it was concluded that these two species were at some point collected and crossbred with each other to develop a population of hybrids that eventually became its own species, and from there it was domesticated into what we see today. The first attempt at genetically analyzing these turned up unfortunate results. They could not find any ancestry with any existing species of Trifolium within the wild species, so it became concluded that the actual progenitor of berseem is actually extinct. However, Dr. Al-Fatah Badir decided to do more genetic tests to see what the origins are, and here are the results. Based on the genetic studies, there's a genetically close relationship between berseem, Trifolium salomonum, and Trifolium berephium, as well as Trifolium aperitum. However, in terms of close relationships, based on crossbreeding experiments and genetic testing, berseem is far closer to Trifolium berephium and Trifolium salomonum. Indeed, The three species, Trifolium periphrym, Trifolium summinum, and Trifolium alexandrium, can crossbreed with each other quite freely, and it's likely that the progenitor of Barceme were mixes of the two wild species, with some strains having more salminium and other strains having more periphrym in their pedigree. Well, that about covers everything. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching this video. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to me on BitChute for a greater variety of content, 4 videos a week. And thank you to all my subscribers on both platforms. I appreciate it.